No one knew she had saved his brother, until the Highland Duke of Dunrath came to find her. I am not the hero of this story. I want to be clear about that before I begin, because men in my position are often tempted to make themselves the center of things, to arrange the events of their lives into a flattering portrait and hang it where guests are sure to admire it. I have no interest in that. I am James Calloway, younger brother to Alastair Calloway, the Duke of Dunrath, and what I am about to tell you is not my story at all. It is hers. Her name was Maren Foss. She was the daughter of a man who had died owing money to half the county, which meant that by the time I stumbled, bleeding and half dead, through the door of the Heather Cross Inn on the worst night of November 3 years ago, she had been reduced to washing linens and serving broth to travelers who never once looked at her face. She had a small room behind the kitchen. She had a brother who was 12 years old and needed shoes. She had a ledger she balanced every Sunday evening to make sure they would last another week. She had, by every reasonable measure of the world that had arranged itself against her, nothing to spare. She gave it all anyway. I should explain how I came to be bleeding on her floor. My brother Alastair and I had been riding back from a dispute at the northern boundary of Dunrath's lands, a land agent, a falsified survey, the sort of ugliness that makes men stupid with rage. We had ridden too fast and too far into weather that had no business turning as quickly as it did, and when the storm came down off the hills, it came down like a judgment. My horse lost a shoe on the ice-slicked road. I did not fall cleanly. Alastair found me first, unconscious in the ditch, and made the only decision a man of his particular character ever makes. He stripped his coat, wrapped it around me, pressed his signet ring into my limp hand so someone would know I mattered, and rode at full gallop for the nearest town to fetch a surgeon. He left me, which sounds monstrous but was in fact the correct calculation. I was alive but not ambulatory. He could bring help. He went. What he did not account for was the second storm cell coming behind the first. I lay in that ditch for I cannot say how long, long enough to stop feeling my feet, long enough to begin the quiet, almost pleasant negotiation that a man conducts with himself when he suspects he is dying. Not yet, not like this, not in a ditch in November with mud in his ear. She found me on the road. She was carrying a lantern and a covered pot of broth she had been contracted to deliver to an elderly farmer a half-mile down the track, and she nearly walked past me because the lantern's light did not reach far enough and I was, apparently, not making much noise. What stopped her was the coat, Alastair's coat, dark wool, silver buttons, the kind of garment that does not belong lying in a country ditch. She bent down. She saw me breathe. She did not scream. She did not run. She set down the broth, considered the situation for a moment with the particular calm of a person who has had occasion to make hard decisions quickly, and then she dragged me. She is not a large woman. This was not a graceful operation, to the edge of the road, propped me against the fence post, and went to fetch her brother. The two of them got me to the inn. I was not, at this point, in any condition to be a useful witness to my own rescue. I have reconstructed what followed from what she told me later, in fragments, reluctantly. She was not a woman who volunteered information about herself, and every detail I extracted cost a question. She put me in the room behind the kitchen, her room. She moved her brother's cot into the kitchen beside the stove and told him that if anyone asked, there was no one in the back room, and he was to look them in the eye when he said it. She sent no word to the village. She did not know who I was. The coat was Alastair's, not mine, and the signet ring was in my unconscious fist, and she had some instinct. She said later that the manner of my wounding, she had assessed this with a thoroughness that quietly astonished me, suggested a fall from a horse and not a casual accident, and that a man in an expensive coat lying in a ditch on a November night was a man someone might be looking for. Not all someones were friends. She cleaned the wound. She had learned this from her mother, who had been, before the debts and the disgrace, a woman of some education and considerable practical skill. She kept the fire going. She made broth that she pressed on me whenever I surfaced toward consciousness, in the particular firm and unarguable way of a woman who has decided that you are going to recover and considers your opinion on the matter largely irrelevant. She did this for 4 days. On the 3rd day, a man came to the inn. He was not a local man. He had the look of hired muscle dressed in respectable clothing, the kind of face that pays attention in a way that has nothing to do with courtesy. He asked the innkeeper, old Mr. Carrow, who knew nothing, whether there had been any unusual guests. He described a young man. He described the coat. Marin was in the kitchen doorway when he asked. She did not look toward the back room. She went to the counter, poured him a cup of cider from the jug she had been carrying, and said that she had found a coat on the road 2 days ago, thought it had blown from a passing cart, and she had given it to the rag man in the village who came through Tuesdays. She said this with the mildness of someone reporting the weather, looking at him with clear, steady eyes, and then she asked whether he'd like bread with the cider because the loaves had just come out of the oven and they were very good today. He took the bread, he thanked her, he left. She told me this 2 days later, with a shrug that suggested she considered it an unremarkable sequence of events. I lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it would have meant for her if she had been caught lying. A debtor's daughter, harboring a stranger, deceiving a man who clearly answered to someone powerful. And I felt something shift behind my sternum that I did not have adequate words for at the time. On the 5th day, Alistair found me. He had spent 4 days tearing the county apart, which I am given to understand was quite something to witness. He arrived at the Heather Cross Inn in the early morning, mud-splashed, hollow-eyed, accompanied by his steward and the county surgeon, and a look on his face that I had never seen there before and would, in subsequent years, come to recognize as the specific expression Alistair Calloway wore when something had frightened him enough to reach past the iron. Marin opened the door. She had not known until that morning that the coat belonged to the Duke of Dunrath. Caro had told her the previous evening. The news had come in from the village, the story of the missing young gentleman, the Duke's frantic search. And when she came to my room and told me, her voice was entirely level and her hands were entirely still, and she said simply, "I should have sent word sooner." I wasn't sure who was looking. She had protected me at her own risk. She had lied to a dangerous man on my behalf. She had never asked my name. When Alistair came through the door and saw her, I watched him stop. He had not slept in 4 days. He was a man who in the ordinary course of things wore his authority the way other men wore their skin, naturally, without effort, without consciousness. He was the Highland Duke of Dunrath, the most feared name in 3 counties, a man who had rebuilt a ruined estate through sheer will and the kind of discipline that frightened even people who admired him. He was not a man who stopped. He stopped. He said, "You found him." She said, "He found the ditch first." I only moved him. He looked at her for a long moment, at the small room, the worn apron, the utter absence of anything that suggested comfort or ease, and I saw something happen in his face that I had seen happen nowhere else in the 15 years I had known my brother. A rearrangement, as if the map of something had been redrawn while he was standing there. He said, "How long did you keep him?" She said, 4 nights. He was difficult about the broth." "I was not difficult," I said from the cot. "You required reasoning with," she said without turning her head. Alistair looked at me. I gave him the expression that means, "I know." I looked at her the same way. He said, "I owe you a debt I don't know how to name." She said, "You owe me nothing. He's your brother." Any decent person would have done the same. She believed this. That was the thing about her that undid him, I think, more than anything else. She genuinely believed it. She had no sense that she had done something remarkable. She had found a man dying in a ditch and brought him in out of the cold, and she had lied to protect him from someone who meant him harm, and she had spent 4 days of her own resources and her own sleep on a stranger she could not afford, and she considered this the obvious minimum. We left that morning. We had to, there were legal matters, a family that needed word, a county that had been turned upside down. Alistair paid Caro for the room and pressed money into Marin's hands for the trouble, and she tried to return it, and he said, with the particular voice he uses when the matter is settled, "Keep it." He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is already trying to understand how to return to. She watched us go from the doorway. I was too weak to be on a horse, so I was in the carriage, and I watched Alistair mount with his usual economy and turn his horse toward the road, and then I watched him stop one more time and look back at the inn. Just for a moment. Then he rode. He did not go back. This is the part I find hardest to explain, because I know my brother, and I know that in the months that followed he thought about her. He was not a man who spoke of his interior life readily. Alistair Calloway communicated most things through action and almost nothing through confession. But I knew the signs. The way he would stop, sometimes in the middle of a sentence. The way he answered questions about the northern road with a brevity that meant he had already considered, and set aside the answer he actually wanted to give. He did not go back because he was, at the core of him, a man with a code, and the code said, "She is a debtor's daughter with nothing, and you are a duke, and to go back now would be to place her in an impossible position. If he returned, it would mean something, and he was not certain she would want it to mean something. She had been so entirely clear that she expected nothing. He did not want to make her feel that she owed him anything in return for his gratitude, that her kindness had obligated her to receive his attention. He stayed away to protect her dignity. He was wrong to do it, and I told him so once, on an evening in the library when he had been staring at the fire for 20 minutes and I had run out of patience. I said, "She is not fragile. She lied to a hired thug in a doorway to save a stranger she'd known for 3 days. She does not need protecting from gratitude." He looked at me, he said nothing. He poured another glass. The third year I went back myself. Not for any complicated reason. I had healed well, I was passing through the north on my own affairs, and I wanted to see her, to thank her again properly, as a man who was now entirely certain he was alive and wished to say so. I had sent a letter at the time. I was not sure it had been a sufficient letter. She was not at the Heather Cross Inn. Caro had died the previous winter, and the inn had been sold to his nephew, who had let the staff go. Marin and her brother had moved to a village called Linbridge, 6 miles east, where she was working as a housekeeper at the rectory. I found her in the rectory garden, hanging laundry. She recognized me. She smiled a small, contained smile, the kind she used for things that pleased her, and we spoke for half an hour in the pale autumn sun about nothing consequential. How her brother was doing. Well, he had apprenticed to a clockmaker in town. What she thought of Linbridge, acceptable. The vicar was a reasonable man. The winters were less brutal than at the inn. She did not ask about Alistair. She asked about me, whether the leg had healed properly, whether I had been careful as I'd been told. She asked as if she had reserved the right, having spent 4 days keeping me alive. I thought about what to say. I decided on honesty. I said, "He thinks about you." She was quiet for a moment. She smoothed a pillowcase on the line with methodical attention. She said, "He is kind to think of me at all." I said, "Marin." She said, "James." She looked at me then, and what I saw in her face was not hope, not exactly, but something beneath hope, something that had been kept very carefully still for 3 years. She had not indulged it. She had been sensible and clear-eyed and entirely without illusion, because she was a woman who had learned that illusions were an expense she could not afford. She had not let herself want something she had decided could not be. I said, "He's an idiot." She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh, and I understood immediately why he couldn't stop thinking about her. I wrote to my brother that evening. I will not reproduce the letter. I am not certain he would forgive me if I did. I will say only that I was not subtle, and that I said the thing plainly, that there was a woman in Linbridge who had saved my life, and lied to a man who might have done her harm and asked for nothing, and that she was presently hanging laundry in a rectory garden, and that if he continued to stand on ceremony at the expense of 2 people's happiness, I was going to tell their mother. He arrived in Linbridge 11 days later. I was not there for it. I know what happened from Alistair, which means I know it in pieces, baldly stated, with the feeling compressed out of it the way he compresses all feelings, but I know enough. He went to the rectory. She opened the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the way he apparently has a habit of standing in doorways where she is concerned, and then he said, not entirely smoothly for a man of his particular poise, "I owe you a debt I have been too proud and too cautious to pay, and I have been wrong about both of those things, and I would like to speak with you if you will allow it." She allowed it. They walked. Linbridge has a long lane beside the mill stream that is, apparently, pleasant in November if you have enough coat, which Alistair always does. They talked for 2 hours. He told her about the 4 days he had spent looking, and what it had felt like to come through the door of the Heather Cross Inn and find me on a cot alive. He told her, and this cost him something, I could tell from the way he described it, that in the weeks after, when he had thought about why he had stopped, he had understood it was not only her dignity he had been protecting, but his own. He had not known how to begin. He had not known how to be with her, a man who felt rather than simply decided. She made him feel things he hadn't arranged for. She listened to all of this. She had, he said, the particular quality of attention that made you feel that what you said was landing somewhere real, that she was genuinely present for it, not managing the conversation but receiving it. When he finished, she said, "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel you owed me. Not a return visit, not a letter, not anything. What I did, I'd do it again for anyone. That's not a thing you can be indebted for." He said, "I know, I'm not here because of the debt." She looked at him. He said, "I'm here because I have thought about you nearly every day for 3 years, and I am tired of being sensible about it." They were married the following spring, in the small stone church in Linbridge, not the cathedral in Edinburgh, not the grand ceremony that Alastair's rank would have suggested, because Marin had made it quite clear that she wanted a wedding she could recognize as her own, and not a piece of pageantry arranged around her. And Alastair, who had spent his entire adult life engineering everything, built her exactly the wedding she described. Her brother was there. He had grown into a steady, quietly proud young man, and he walked her to the altar with the gravity of someone who understood the weight of what was happening. The vicar, who had employed her and known her for 2 years, told me afterward that he had never conducted a ceremony where he was quite so certain that both people understood what they were agreeing to. I stood beside my brother. He did not look at the guests, he looked at her. She came up the aisle in a pale blue dress that her mother would have recognized and her father would have cried to see. And when she reached him, she looked at him with those clear, steady eyes, the same eyes that had assessed a bleeding stranger in a ditch, and decided, without drama, to bring him in. And she gave him the small, contained smile she reserved for things that genuinely pleased her. He took her hand. The vicar spoke. The candles flickered in the November draft. "I am not the hero of this story, but I was there and I can tell you this. There are moments in a life that you carry intact, not summarized, not reconstructed, but whole, and this was one of them." My brother's face when she said yes. The way he held her hand with the particular care of a man who has been given something he knows the value of. She had saved my life in a ditch on a November road. She had asked for nothing. She got everything,